super excited to be here for the inaugural Escape conference. I'm really glad that Jim and the team at Cockroach put this together. So I'm Bassam Tabbara. I'm the CEO and founder of UpBound. I'm also a maintainer on a project called Rook and a maintainer on a project called Crossplane. Kind of spend most of the day today, or most of my time, talking about Crossplane because I think it's the most relevant to the multi-cloud discussion. So I want to start with talking about this dynamic between hyperclouds and commercial open source companies and building essentially boutique clouds around it. This has been covered immensely in the media from a licensing perspective. I'm sure you've all heard of licensing and relicensing and dual licenses and everything else. I won't touch any of that. I want to talk about a potential technological solution to this problem. And mostly motivate what motivate the Crossplane project that we think is an important part here. So first, let me start with let's look at this dynamic looking at this from a perspective of a hypercloud. So if you think about, if we kind of look at an anatomy of a hypercloud, typically they're made up of regions and zones, pretty standard, and they offer a buffet of managed services. Typically, Amazon has 200 plus managed services, and they tend to be either open source software, things like Postgres and MySQL that Amazon has wrapped, and they have built and integrated really deeply into their platform, or their proprietary managed services, things like Dynamo or Aurora and others are good examples of that. At the heart of every cloud is a control plane. The control plane is a very central piece. It's the one that's serving the API. It's the one that when you say, I need an RDS instance or I need a VM, it's the one that's provisioning it. It's figuring out where it goes. There's usually a scheduling act. And it's the one that has all the lifecycle management and automation, day 2 to day 99 automation that's built on top of this control plane. Every cloud provider is structured this way. Typically, a control plane at the heart of it and a set of managed services that are around the control plane. There are also a set of integration services that are built around the control plane, things like authorization, authentication, metering, billing, monitoring, logging, all those things that come together around the control plane and give it a very integrated platform feel. When I go to Amazon, or I go to Azure, or I go to Google, I can use any of their managed services. They all share the same authentication scheme. They all have IAM rules that work consistently. They all integrate into their monitoring, billing. Everything else works consistently and is integrated. So as an end user, I basically get a single API endpoint, a single management console, and a single or consistent set of tools that I could use. It's a completely integrated story, and the cloud providers have done a fantastic job building essentially a completely integrated platform for our use on a pay-as-you-go basis. If you look at this from the perspective of a commercial open source company, one that is trying to get to cloud, they have a number of choices. Typically, they started out by building either open source software or building vibrant communities around it, and maybe they're monetizing it from enterprise licenses but they realize they have to go to the cloud, and they have a bunch of choices to make. The easiest one is they just add their software to one of the hyperclouds marketplace. That's a really simple solution. You add it to the marketplace. It's running it as if it was running software, like a customer would be running software themselves, but it's a very limited option. It's limited in integration. You don't get to be in the management console. You don't get any of the services. There's really not much besides billing integration that is provided for you. They also have very limited business models, how you charge your customers, and you have very little access to the customers. You don't get to see what they're doing with your product or what they're doing with their software. It's completely limited. So the next step is a much harder step, but one that increasingly more and more companies are doing, which is they end up building their own cloud. And what that entails is they have to build their own control planes. They have to do their own automation for managing the software and layering on top of other clouds. They have to build new tools and CLI tools. It's the price of entry to having a cloud. That's what everyone that wants to have a cloud offering needs to do. Typically, these clouds are not in a hosting business. Thank God they're not also building data centers while they're doing that, but they layer on top of other clouds using things like VPCs and VMs, running in VMs, or maybe on containers or Kubernetes. But they also have to build things like their own authentication schemes and billing and metering, taking credit cards, and all of that stuff has to happen so that they end up with a cloud offering of their one managed service. So I call it a cloud of one. And those are increasingly popular, and we see more and more companies moving in that direction because they don't have access to the, first-class access to the hypercloud. Things like Amazon or Google. And of course, given that these companies typically offer platform software like databases or message queues or others, they have to support multiple cloud environments. They can't just say we are on Amazon because their customers will require them to be on other clouds. So at some level, they're building a multi-cloud managed service at some level. So let's switch gears and look at this from a perspective of an end user, a customer, somebody in an enterprise or a DevOps person. What they see is a very heterogeneous world. They see a set of cloud providers. They see a set of boutique clouds, all independent, all with their own APIs. If you're a customer and say you're an Amazon shop, and you stick to just Amazon, then you have a single API endpoint, everything's integrated, everything just works. It's completely integrated. If you were to venture out and use just one external cloud service, whatever it is, you have to figure out how to set up a new vendor, which is an accounting, financial discussion. You got to build some automation. Your central infrastructure teams will probably want you to write a bunch of plugins or automation templates, scripts, et cetera, that help the deployment of this new service. You probably have to go through security and compliance, monitoring integration, logging integration, and then, of course, go through the education and setup that you have to, education and training that you have to do to get people to understand what's happening here. And if you multiply that by all the services that you want to use, it becomes a really hairy problem. And there are some attempts at solving this problem. Tools, infrastructure automation tools kind of help. They help you with your custom engineering around this. There are solutions out there trying to put everything, changes the operating model of how we consume things. We're back to running software as opposed to, say, using managed services. And almost always, these solutions are closed and vendor-driven solutions. So if you kind of sum it up, we'd say, think about it from a perspective of an end user, this person in the middle of the slide. At one level, they could use a good enough service, completely integrated, vertically integrated from their hypercloud of choice. Let's pick, on a time series database. Their cloud offering has one. It's completely integrated. They can API call away or a click away, consume it, use it, no additional setup, it just works. Or they could decide to venture out and use some best-of-breed time series database that has amazing features. How good do these features have to be to get over, to kind of step over this integration hurdle? That's the dilemma. That's the dilemma that we face when we look at this dynamic. The solution to this problem is getting to a point where we. And so let me kind of explain how we think through this. So a universal control plane is a control plane, just like within every cloud provider or within any of the boutique clouds. But it's one that's actually available and offers standardization to everyone. So instead of building your own control plane, you could extend an existing one. And the value of doing that is that we standardize on APIs and we standardize on automation. This standardization on APIs and automation is happening today within the hyperclouds. This is why you get an integrated experience at Amazon or Google or Azure. But it's not happening in the community. It's not happening across the ecosystem of folks that are innovating on platforms and infrastructure. Instead, we leave it to the end users to put it all together. And so by having a universal control plane that offers first-class extensibility, someone that is working on the next cloud service is able to plug into this control plane and is able to offer and integrate with other services on the same control plane. The control plane would offer, would automate provisioning, lifecycle management, and even service-to-service integrations, things that are common and you see today in hyperclouds. Obviously, this first extensibility is a big part of this play. Everyone is first class. There is no marketplace. It has to be a level playing field for everyone for this to work. And there would have to be a set of shared services, things like billing, metering, authorization, monitoring, logging, that turn it into a platform, make it feel like an integrated platform. Things that, again, table stakes at any large cloud provider. And finally, this can't be open source and have a strong open governance model and be community driven. It's just the nature of it is a central piece, and it has to be driven by the community. That's what motivated the Crossplane project. We started this project in last December. Its purpose is to be the open source multi-cloud control plane. That is the goal of Crossplane. And so we started with a really popular control plane, the Kubernetes control plane. We based Crossplane on the API machinery of Kubernetes, which means that it's instantly familiar to a very large community, the cloud-native community. You can use kubectl. You can use the entire ecosystem building around the Kubernetes API. But now you can do more than just containers. You can actually run and consume infrastructure across all clouds and vendors, popular vendors, on this control plane. So we've essentially taken the approach of building a control plane that manages containers and extended it to a control plane that manages the cloud. And thereby standardizing on API and standardizing on automation around it. One Crossplane can be attached to multiple clusters, multiple regions, or multiple clouds. So that means that you have a single point of control, whether you want to be multi-cloud, multi-region, hybrid, any of those combinations are possible. And it's the host for automation. It's not just dealing with provisioning. It's dealing with day 2 to day 99 or day 500 life cycle management and changes are built and run on this within the control plane. Again, very similar to how, if you were to peek behind the scenes in a hypercloud, similar to how they build things internally. It offers a strong separation of concern, which means that your infrastructure team could actually set policies and own the environments, and then your app teams can self-service. They don't even need cloud credentials to run and deploy. And obviously, it's built with a high level of extensibility around it. So as a concrete demo, a concrete example of this, let's take we have this running. One of our big partners is GitLab. GitLab is probably one of the coolest multi-cloud apps that I know of. It's a non-trivial app, 50+ microservices. It needs Postgres, it needs Redis, it needs object storage, volumes, and it has really interesting growth and failure patterns around it. So with GitLab, we authored a stack that runs on top of Crossplane. Essentially, you can kubectl apply GitLab, and GitLab comes up through Crossplane on 3 clouds. And when it comes up on Amazon, it's using EKS, it's using RDS, it's using Elastic Cache, it's using S3, it's using volumes, EBS volumes. It's coming up using the best facilities available on each of the cloud providers. And it also contains the stack that's running on Crossplane contains the logic that is able to essentially manage GitLab itself, whether it's how to upgrade GitLab or do lifecycle management of GitLab itself. So it's a great example of how to run this. And in fact, next we're doing on-premises using the Rook project, and then for a demo, we have CockroachDB serving because Cockroach talks Postgres on the wire, serving Postgres to GitLab, which is a cool scenario. So let me step back and say a universal control plane is a really critical ingredient to opening up the cloud. And that's why we are investing there, and we think it's a really important. But what does that mean kind of to the overall kind of industry? To borrow kind of from Andy Grove, I'd say, if you look at where we are today, we basically have a very small set of vertically cloud providers. And with a universal control plane, we can tip the market from being vertically integrated to going to horizontal integration. It's ironic to think of the major hyperclouds as the mainframes of the 80s, before we switched to the PC world and went to essentially a more horizontally integrated market. But that is where we are. We have big vertically integrated cloud providers. And if we're able to get to the point where people have choice, both at every layer, infrastructure, runtimes, platforms, applications, and not give up integration, we would basically have arrived at opening up the market and opening up the cloud computing market and enabling everyone to have more choice around that. So it's definitely going to take a village. I'm here talking both as I'm mostly talking here as a maintainer on the Crossplane project, and I'd like to invite you all to come join this journey. It's going to take time, and it's going to take a big effort for everyone to be part of this. So please come contribute. You can start today with Crossplane 0.3. Come talk to us about it. It's a really exciting time, and thank you.